I'd like to introduce Phil Bowen, who's the director for the Center of Justice Innovation here in London. Welcome to Justice Speaks.
Thank you very much for having me.
And it's a real pleasure to be here with you. And I want you to start this interview with telling us a little about yourself.
Okay, so I was born in North London from parents. One parent who was also born in North London, the other parent from New Jersey.
So you're a part American?
I'm part American.
Okay.
I was a British and American citizen until actually relatively recently gave up my American citizenship for tax purposes. So always, sort of came from a household that was influenced as much by baseball as it was by football, or soccer, as you guys would call it. Went away to university in Scotland, in St Andrews, did history, and kind of went to St Andrews, which is a sort of village on the side of the sea with a golf course, because I always knew I'd come back to London and work. I always knew I was interested in politics and government. And so when I was graduating from doing history at St Andrews, wanted to apply to do something in the field of public policy. And so applied to be a civil servant through a thing called the Fast Stream. And as part of that process, you sort of elect 3 or 4 policy issues, current policy issues that you're interested in. And one of them was drugs policy. And so through a slightly mysterious black box process, was allocated to a place called the Home Office, which it was at the time our government department for both justice and homeland security.
Okay.
And that's sort of where I got involved with my first brushes with public policy and working in Parliament. So my first job was on a counter-terrorism bill. This is just after 9/11. So taking a bill through the various stages of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And so really kind of beginning to get an education in how public policy works, how Parliament works or doesn't work. And then increasingly, as I went through that career, started working in places like policing, corrections, prisons, probation. And so was sort of in this department that in 2007 split. So the Homeland Security responsibility stayed at the Home Office, and I got moved into what became the Ministry of Justice. Worked there for a couple more years, ended my civil service career in the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, which was a kind of public services innovation unit that tried to look at, are we delivering value for money and good outcomes for citizens? And decided after 11 years of doing that kind of work, of being a bureaucrat, as my one of my American friends always calls me, being a bureaucrat for 11 years, decided to leave and do something else. As part of that, I went off to East Africa for a while, doing development work, and then was coming back from that in search of a job, because that hadn't really worked out well for me. I just hadn't enjoyed it. And my former boss, when I'd done a year, I did this amazing year in New York City on secondment as a Home Office civil servant to an organization that at the time was called the Center for Court Innovation in New York. They had sponsored me to be in New York for a year. I'd loved that work. I'd always kept in touch with them. And when I was coming back from East Africa, my friend Aubrey at the time, who had been my boss in New York, got in touch and was talking about a possible job.
Well, let's talk about that. So I hadn't realized you'd spent a year in New York.
Mm-hmm.
You're used to New York winters then.
Yes.
Which are different than winters here in London.
They are different, yes.
But it also gave you a chance sort of to see your ancestry in a reverse way for us who are Americans who are of descent from the island here.
Yeah.
That must have been interesting for you.
It was fascinating. So I was very lucky. I was in New York for just a little over a year, and I kind of did 2 things. So one thing, I was doing a piece of research for the Home Office on problem-solving courts and how problem-solving courts had evolved in America and how they were being mainstreamed across America, and what kind of it took to take individual courts that had done successfully, how did you expand those statewide? Mm-hmm. So I was doing that kind of piece of research, but the other half of my job was being what was called a resource coordinator in the Bronx Criminal Court.
Okay.
So
one of our famous ones.
One of your famous ones, yes. Bonfire of the Vanities was in my suitcase as I came over. And so I got to see up close, mostly arraignment parts in the Bronx Criminal Court. And my job was to, on certain cases, stand up and be part of the brokering of plea bargaining and saying, well, this defendant is up for facing maybe 2 or 3 days jail. Wouldn't it be better if we gave them 2 days community service, 2 days social service, and doing that kind of work? So working with defense lawyers, working with obviously the judges on the bench and DAs to do that plea bargaining, which to me was just fascinating because I was in this amazing city, but also in this sort of kind of processing factory in many ways, and encountering plea bargaining, which we don't have in quite the same way. We don't have it here. And it sort of felt like this sort of almost like market.
Yes.
Where, it's like, well, is 3 days enough? Well, how about, my 3 days beats your 2 days jail? Yeah. And it was very enlightening. I wouldn't say always that I thought it was the most just outcomes.
And I would agree with that.
I certainly walked defendants to our intake office who were like, when's my next court appearance? And I was like, you've just pleaded guilty and this is what you've got. And they were like, but I'm not guilty. And I was like, okay, we're going to have to take you back into court. But it was fascinating, obviously. And I was very lucky. The Centre for Court Innovation at the time was doing a lot of work around community courts, so their flagship projects in Midtown and Red Hook. And the Bronx was an attempt to take those principles and apply them in a big state courthouse. And I think I was there in the first year or 2 years of that program. So it was a fascinating education.
So you became deeply involved in problem-solving courts while you were in the United States.
Yeah.
So you sort of touched on lightly the idea that you then came back to the UK, and at some point, the Center for Justice Innovation, which starting here.
Yeah.
What is the center? How did it start?
What's its history? So partly because of things like the Midtown Court and the Red Hook Community Justice Centre, British policymakers, British politicians were interested in those ideas, had heard the stories about what was going on in New York. And part of the reason I went to work at the centre was we had set up in the UK a thing called the North Liverpool Community Justice Centre. We'd set up the first types of drug court pilots. So there'd been interest in what was going on in the problem-solving court movement in the States because, like a lot of jurisdictions, high prison population, are there ways we can control this through kind of better ways of dispensing justice in the community? So there's been interest in what the Centre for Court Innovation had developed, especially in Red Hook, but also in other treatment court pilots. And that continued, so my secondment was part of that links between England and Wales and what was going on in New York. And then that continued. I came back as a civil servant and did other things, but that continued, and they kept on getting British visitors coming over, especially to see Red Hook. And I think in Greg Berman, who was director of the Centre for Court Innovation at the time, who also happened to be an Anglophile and an Arsenal fan, was quite interested in coming to London on a more regular basis because he kept on seeing this parade of Brits coming through. And it was like, okay, well, maybe there's something in this. Yep. And equally, my now friend, but my boss at the time, Aubrey, was equally servicing some of that British interest. And so through various processes, they were exploring, well, what would a London office look like? And could we get money for it? So that was all sort of happening in sort of 2009, 10, around the sort of time I was leaving the civil service and going off to other pastures. So it just so happened, so wind forward, Aubrey had spent a year doing development work in London, trying to see if the concept of a Centre for Justice Innovation would work in a British climate, whether he could raise money for it. He'd spent a year doing that work and, yes, people saw a need for something that sort of brought together research and practice, that wasn't just a think tank, that wasn't academic, that was trying to actually do stuff in real time, and found a little bit of money for it. But he had a wife at home and needed to move back to the States, and so they had sort of the shell of an organization and a bank account and an idea that they told people on, but needed someone to make that become a reality. And it just was one of those like great opportunities in life that Aubrey and Greg went, well, what about you? Are you interested? And I thought about it. And I thought, do I want to do this? Maybe I want to become more of an academic. And then I thought, hang on, this feels like I get to be based in London, a city I love. I get to travel on a regular basis to New York, another city I love, and do work in criminal justice, which I'd not worked in for sort of a year or so, and I was beginning to miss, and thought, okay, well, I'll give it a whirl. I've never run a charity. I've never run an organization.
Why not?
Why not? I'll do it for a couple of years. And at that time, my hair was darker. My beard hadn't quite grown, and 12 years later, I'm still there.
So why the Center for Justice Innovation? At the time, the center in New York was called the Center for Court Innovation.
Yeah.
So what was the thought behind it?
I think the thinking behind it was, and I should say now the Center for Court Innovation in the States is the Center for Justice Innovation. I think
agree.
the thinking behind it was the center in New York was already doing non-court work. So it was doing work in the kind of pre-court area of police-led diversion. It was already doing in its community justice projects, doing much more work that was non-court based. So, for example, they'd set up the Brownsville Community Justice Center, which originally had been, can we develop a justice center that eventually will have a court in it? And then through community engagement, the community was relatively clear it did not want a court. And so it's kind of a community center. And so I think already by the time that they were thinking of setting up the center here, they were beginning to see the limits of being solely a court-based organization. I think that's still their bread and butter.
Yep.
But it allowed the center in the UK to have a much broader remit than just courts.
Yeah, and at some point, while it starts out as a sister agency of center in New York City, it becomes a separate organization.
Yeah.
You were in charge of it at that moment. How did that evolve? How did you become a more independent organization?
I mean, there's a slightly boring answer to that, unfortunately, which is funders who wanted to fund a British centre wanted it to be very clearly British and therefore a British charity.
And rightly so.
They wanted to see have the transparency of their money being kept. Not that there was ever any real suggestion that the money that was raised for the British Centre would find its way going back to New York, either vice versa. But a lot of the money pledged at the start was on the basis of it becoming a British charity. So there was a sort of slightly prosaic answer to that. I think there were also, again, more technical things of, having Centre for Court Innovation Amex cards was actually a real burden because Amex is not used as well as much in the UK. So there were just some very practical things.
Right.
I think sort of more foundationally, I very early on wanted it to feel authentically grounded in British notions of justice, British cultures and traditions,
which are somewhat different than American.
Yeah,
we were discussing that before we started the interview.
Exactly.
I think it's interesting about those differences.
Yeah,
if we had a longer time, I'd get into it.
Absolutely.
But I think you're correct.
Yeah, and I think there was always a sense from the Aubrey and Greg, who sort of were some of the founding fathers of the centre here, was it should at some point stand on its own 2 feet and become authentically a British entity. I don't think they'd maybe quite grasped how important it was to our original backers that happened quickly. So my first 6-9 months was spent on relatively dull governance issues of sorting out how we separate out to be a different thing while keeping some of the work going. But there was a lot of how do we become a charity, and I was sort of looking up the how-to guides of how does one set up a charity in England and Wales.
And so you in a sense designed the shape of the center here in London.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true to say that our sister organisation was the kind of animating guide and spirit to our foundation and a lot of our early work, and it still informs a lot of the work we do in that we have common and shared problems. So we all have problems with high prison populations, high use of custodial remand, those kinds of things. So there's always an element to which we can discuss shared problems. The shared problems of domestic abuse are not radically different in America as they are to England and Wales in many ways. But the solutions are different. There is enough difference. So I always wanted to speak with a British accent.
And you do that quite well.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like I was born here.
Yeah, almost.
So I would, Courtney Bryan, who's the executive director of the Centre for Justice Innovation in New York, sits on my board, and her input is very valuable. So I still see the relationship between the two centres as a kind of sister to sister organisation thing. They do things differently. We do things differently to them, but there's a constant dialogue.
So, what's the focus of the center? And then after we talk about that, I want to talk about your focus as director.
So when I first started, there were, I guess, two guiding thoughts that I had about the centre's work. One was that there was a certain amount of interest and discussion, public policy debate around policing and frontline policing, and there was a lot of civic society organisation interest in prison. And I thought, let's not do either of those two things. Let's do everything else. So let's do not what does good neighbourhood policing look like, but let's do what happens when a kid gets arrested and how they then get charged, how that charge turns into a court appearance and what happens in that court and what the community sentencing options are for a child. Or let's look at how probation works. But once someone has gone to prison, there are 1,001 other charities looking at conditions in prison, what does good education in prison look like, all of that stuff. So very pragmatically, I just thought other people have got expertise in other bits of work, and we should focus on what I've at various points called the middle bit.
Okay, so you move them into what you're calling the middle bit.
Yeah.
And what's your role in all of that? I mean, right now,
yeah,
I assume that you do more than organize the charity.
Yeah. But you mean what I personally do?
Yep.
So I have my position has evolved from, being one or two guys in a room with a laptop to an organisation with 23 staff and a budget of 1.5 million. So the job of the director has evolved from how do I set up a charity and how do we get the bills paid to, I would say 40% of my time is spent on team management and people management, as any good boss should be. So in creating the right culture and the right environment for people to work in. I would say 20% of my time is spent on our Westminster and Whitehall government-focused policy work. So trying to influence discussions that happen in Parliament and happen in government around criminal justice, family justice, and civil justice reform. And then the other 20% is fundraising. It's only 80%. There's 20% for fun, but a lot is fundraising. Yeah.
And let's talk about that. How is the Institute funded?
So we are primarily at the moment funded through charitable foundations. So we've had long, historic, and strong links with foundations like the Hadley Trust, which is sponsored Aubrey Fox to come over and do the initial year of finding out could a centre for court innovation or justice innovation work in the UK. They have been our primary backers for 13 years. Other foundations like the Barrow Cadbury Trust, which is the people who, all the money comes from the chocolate family.
Yep.
They have invested in us and funded us to do work over the last 13 years, off and on, around young adults and their experience of the justice system. So mostly it's charitable foundation. Occasionally it's government contracts too. So relatively recently, we did some work for the Department for Education, looking at family treatment courts. That's in public family law. So where kids are potentially at risk of being taken away from their parents because of abuse and neglect. We've been doing work for the Department for Education, looking at how the family treatment courts currently work, how could they be expanded and taken to the mainstream. So it's a combination of private foundations, philanthropists, and occasionally government money.
But no real direct fundraising. I mean, you don't have
we don't do sponsored
charitable event where people come in and
no.
Okay.
No.
But still, that's a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had any charity chief exec in this seat, they would say that, 40% of their job is helping their team churn out applications for new bits of work. And part of what guides the work we do at the centre is, what we're interested in, where we think we can make an impact, and what we think the urgent problems are. But also, when you get down to it, where is there money to fix those, to fund us to fix those problems?
When I was reviewing your website,
yeah,
and prepping for this, I see you have a number of areas of work focus, including smart sentencing, improving fairness, and we've sort of just touched on family, drug, and alcohol courts, and problem-solving courts in general.
Yep.
Is that the primary focus of the Institute currently?
Yeah, I mean, so we've got one of our areas of focus is what we call now out-of-court resolutions. This is that there's something like 30% of all disposals in our criminal justice system are police-led diversion programs. So
really?
Someone is linked to an offence, sometimes charged, but not always. But they're relatively low harm crimes. So it's basically, let's say, a drug possession case, a small amount of marijuana is found, the drug's destroyed, and the person, if they agree to it, is given an out-of-court resolution, and they need to attend a drug education program, for example.
It's a pre-court diversion.
So it's a pre-court diversion program,
which we do have in the United States, but only for juveniles, really.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Is it successful?
So we've done a lot of work around it for children, and there is pretty strong evidence that taking kids out of the formal criminal justice system as much as we can when they're in that early stage of their offending careers, some of whose offending careers will literally stop and end at that one incident.
Right.
It's pretty effective. There are areas, as you would imagine, in the evidence base where we don't know what programming quite works for which child.
Right.
And there are problems like there are children who will get diversions and may get 2 or 3 diversions who go on then to commit serious crimes or become prolific offenders. And we find it very hard to spot which one is going to be which. But in general,
no human system is perfect.
No.
But
in general, yes, it works.
I think it works.
Yeah.
My sense of is research that I've seen out of New York is that if you have a person who's low risk, which is they're not likely to reoffend, low needs, which is to say they don't have a substance use issue. The less contact with the system they have, the better. Right. Because they don't then get involved with people who are criminals. Right. So I think that's a very interesting thing that you're doing.
And our work in that area has really been to support primarily police forces, but also in the youth system, youth justice services, which are local services, to implement the best practice that we know of and to share good practice. So a lot of the work we do, I would say 2/3 of the actual work that my team does is what we call practice support and practice development, which is working with probation, police, others to spread good practice, define what good practice is and spread it. And sort of going back to one of your other questions about what I want the centre to do, when I was in government, I did a lot of work on policy, and we'd write a great strategy or a new piece of legislation and be like, oh, it's a problem solved, right?
Right.
It never was. No. And I always thought there was this real gap between policy intentions and implementation and delivery. So, as I said, 2/3 of the work of the centre is on that incremental innovation of like actually making the system work better and taking the best of what's happening in Cambridge and making sure that Canterbury's doing the same thing, and then seeing Canterbury get better than Cambridge, and it's all of that stuff. And sometimes it's kind of under the car bonnet, nuts and bolts, really small tweaks just to get that extra bit of juice.
There's a phrase that some Americans are not going to know.
That's true. Yes.
So you're getting under the hood.
Under the hood.
So tell me, coming back to a phrase that some of our people who are listening to this may not know, smart sentencing.
Yeah.
What's involved in it?
So our program around smarter sentencing is, at the moment, it's twofold. So one is looking at, so we have a high prison population in England and Wales compared to Western Europe. Scotland does as well. Surprisingly, Northern Ireland doesn't, but that's a different matter. High prison population, are we making the best judgments we can about who we incarcerate? And could there be better decisions made if our community sentencing programs were better, if judges had more confidence in them, if our probation service was set up in the right way? So we've done a lot of work on things like how does probation deliver better pre-sentence reports that command the confidence of judges? What does a good community sentence look like for people with substance use issues? What does what you would call community service, what we would call unpaid work, what does that look like? And are there different types of unpaid work that work better for different people? So a lot of that work. Currently, our biggest project in that program of smarter sentencing is looking at court fines. So 75% of all criminal cases result in a court fine and nothing else. 50% of those cases, the court fine is not paid after 12 months or 18 months, can't quite remember. So why are people not paying because they don't want to or because they can't pay? So we've been doing some research funded by the Financial Fairness Trust on what's the data on court fines, what's the experience of getting a court fine like for people on low incomes? Are the courts well set up to judge whether a court fine that they set is ever going to be paid by someone of limited means? And we're now working on how do we improve that process? Are there particular offences that always result in court fines that don't need to be there in the first place?
And that fines and costs, as we would call them in the United States, are an interesting area because there is some research out of the States that suggests that a fair number of the people actually can't pay. I'd be very interested in what the outcomes of your study are, so I'll keep in touch with you on that. One of the areas of focus is what I would call procedural fairness, which you call improving fairness on your website. You want to talk a little about what the center's doing there?
Yeah. So again, partly based on our American heritage, they've done a lot of work because of their work around court innovation on procedural justice and making court process feel fairer for people going through them. And that has always felt, as someone who, as an organisation that's regularly does research on our magistrates' courts, that's our lowest level of court forum. When you sit in those courts, you can see people coming out of the back end of a court case going, I don't really know what just happened.
That's true.
Right? And I witnessed that in the Bronx. This is a common problem. And, I'm sure if
it's a shared problem.
It's a shared problem. So part of the work we've done around improving fairness has been to equip courts with ways of systematically looking at what is the experience like for the people who come to court, whether they're defendants, victims, witnesses, family members of the above. What does that experience look like, feel like? How could we improve it? How can we embrace the 4 tenets of procedural fairness? So How do they understand what's happening to them right now, what will happen in the future, and what their choices are? How do we make sure that they feel like the decisions made about them are being made impartially and with neutrality? As they go through that process, are the professionals involved in that, treating them with human dignity and respect? And fourthly, and I would say probably the biggest challenge, is how do we give them a voice in that process? And that, I think, the last one is particularly, well, in some ways, particularly easier to accomplish in our problem-solving courts, because there's the judicial monitoring process where judges are trained to ask, interrogate, and do motivational interviewing with defendants. So there is a lot of opportunity for them people to voice, yes, I'm not doing that well on my program because, my mum's ill and I'm having to do, just to talk about human things. Bigger challenge of a standard docket of a magistrate's court on a Monday morning, all the overnight cases. How do you give more than 30 seconds, 2 minutes to each case? And the defense lawyers really want their client giving voice to why they're there and all of that challenge. So there are all sorts of challenges around it.
But that's an interesting aside. But I think that the research tells us that giving voice to a participant in the courtroom, be they a defendant or a victim or whatever, improves outcomes. And voice being the fundamental baseline for the other three. When you combine all that, you get legitimacy, and legitimacy results in obedience to orders.
Absolutely.
So I think it's really important that voice be given, and the research says that if it is given, we get better outcomes. So I think you have a really interesting little description of procedural fairness on your website. It's a sort of a cartoon. And I think it really is very effective at describing it. So if somebody goes to your website, remembering that center is spelled R-E here, I think they could learn something that's really useful in a worldwide context.
Well, I think the challenges I think that we currently have, is all courts are too busy. So they are involved in obviously improvement processes, but a lot of that's around efficiency and timeliness. But the other one is what does procedural fairness look like now in remote court hearings, where you have sometimes all the professionals in one room and the defendant in another? How do you ensure people feel fairly treated when they're at the end of a Teams chat? It's difficult. We need to work on it, and I think no one's got the answer to it, and we're all kind of trying to sort out what are people's experiences of remote court hearings, because they are a fact of life now.
So you have something else that's a major initiative of the center, which is called the Common Ground Justice Project. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so this is actually a project that we are incubating. So we were approached 12 months ago by some people that I knew who had worked in a really brilliant charity that had worked with young men coming out of prison and getting them employment. And they were, like a lot of us in the kind of civic society sector, recognizing that we've got a very polarized debate around crime and justice, which is generally arms race between who can be tougher than the other political party. And there are...
We have that same issue in the United States.
And there are, at the moment in the UK, quite a fractured political discourse, because we've got the rise of a party called Reform, which is sort of upsetting what for years has been a duopoly between Labour and the Conservatives, and part of the political ground that they're fighting on is around law and order. And so we have this very fractured conversation, which seems to suggest that the only sort of popular approach to law and order is to be tougher and tougher and tougher. And yet we systemically are at a point where our prisons are completely full. We're having to already release people early. There's a sentencing bill that's just been introduced into Parliament, I think, today, which is looking at releasing people a third way through their sentences. So we've got politicians talking about getting tougher and tougher, but a system that's also at breaking point. So the Common Ground Justice Project is an attempt to try to understand and find where there is common ground between the various competing traditions in British politics, to try and find whether there actually are ways of getting past this at times binary conversation about tough and soft, and think about, well, actually, are the public, I guess the starting premise of Common Ground Justice is the public actually don't view these things in a binary way. They get that people need to be punished for the crimes they commit, but we'd like to rehabilitate them so they don't do it again. So how do we find the sweet spot between those competing traditions?
And I would argue that there are the sweet spots of effective sentencing.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we understand that the public's primary concern, I think, at least in the United States, is I want to be safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
After that, there is a punishment element. I've long argued that if you can establish that someone probably won't commit a crime again who's committed a heinous crime such as murder,
right,
you still have a punishment element there. Right. Otherwise, the public will not believe that justice is being done.
Absolutely.
But within the broad range of criminal justice, effective sentencing, effective approaches to this seems to me to be better. It sounds like that's what you're trying to aim for.
Absolutely. So the Common Ground Justice Project is an attempt to listen hard at what the public's actually saying, what the public actually believes, and to try and see what we've heard from, for example, people who've self-represented as right-wing on crime and justice issues, and say we need to send more people to prison, but in the same breath then say, but I just don't think our drug laws work and we should decriminalize. So you get sort of right-wing answers and left-wing answers. And actually a lot of people are in those positions of recognizing that, yes, people need to take moral responsibility for their actions, but they're also driven by broader social forces like drugs and poverty and homelessness.
Yep.
So what we actually find when that project is doing its engagement with the public is the public's nuanced.
Yep.
And there are different camps of the public, and those shift depending on the questions you ask.
And I think that that's really true on a broad range of justice issues.
Absolutely.
The public actually has a better understanding than we often give them credit for.
I completely agree. So there's been some interesting, so at the moment this government is committed to expanding our prison capacity because we do not have enough spaces. That is going to cost X billion pounds. There are some polls of the public that say they're totally behind that move, and 80% of the public want more prison spaces. When you then ask a different set of questions, right, do you think we're going to be able to build that many prisons? People say, well, we're not really convinced the government is going to be able, is this an empty promise?
Yeah.
And when you ask them, should you use that money to do other things like drug treatment? Actually, there's quite a lot of the public that believes that's also a totally useful way of using public money.
Right.
There's been some really interesting work that a fellow organisation called Transform Justice have done about the pre-court police diversion with victims. Now, the assumption has been victims won't like this thing that doesn't feel like real justice.
Right.
And actually, in doing polling work with victims and focus group work with victims, they just want the case resolved and they want to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Right.
And actually, they can be sold on that pre-court diversion for the right cases. So basically, the public is more nuanced than the newspapers and the mainstream broadcast media would suggest it is. And I just think the Common Ground Justice Project is an attempt to try to shed some light onto that. Where it will go, I mean, this is why we're incubating it. We're not sure where it's all going to go, and we're not sure, is it going to find that sweet spot that breaks down that binary public debate? We'll see.
I think the fact that you're making the attempt interesting and could change some public policy. So I'm going to follow that.
I hope so.
What do you think the center's greatest accomplishment has been in the time that you've been the director, the only director?
The only director. I mean, in a very narrow, self-interested way, we're still here 12 years after. Like, lots of not-for-profits do go to the wall because of funding problems that we've alluded to. So, like, the fact that we're still here is hopefully a sign that we've done work that people have wanted to invest time and energy and money in. But in terms of actual practical stuff, so for example, on the out of court resolution work, that has become a much more standardized, officially recognized part of the system. We're not the only people who've made that happen, but we're part of a mechanism that has, for example, made sure there is national standards around what that looks like. That inspections of police forces of these justice services include looking at that cohort of people. There are things that I would call problem-solving courts. The government has labelled intensive supervision courts. It's a new initiative to build that treatment court project that include the first that I know of attempts to do gender-specific women's problem-solving courts that are looking solely at keeping women out of short-term prison. So we have that. In the family system, we have 13 what you would call family treatment courts, what we call family drug and alcohol courts. When we inherited that work, there were 8, so we've expanded it. There are more courts that use that method than there were when we took it over. So there are things in the world that exist because of us.
But I think it's a fair description to say that your organization is affecting the British justice system, and that's a huge accomplishment.
I'd hope so. So we've just had a big review of sentencing that a former Lord Chancellor, David Gauke, did. And in a number of places, not just recommendations that we've made from a kind of think tank perspective, but actual work that we've been doing that's there in the world is referenced in that work. So, for example, the one service that we actually operationally run, which is called the Highbury Community Advice Service, which is a advice desk in a magistrate's court that can provide debt advice, housing advice to anyone who comes in, has been referenced in that sentencing review. So there are lots of things that are referenced in government policy that we've contributed directly to. That said, there are still lots of problems in the justice system. There is still a lot of work to be done.
Which brings me to my next question. What are your greatest challenges?
I think the greatest challenge outside of keeping the show on the road and fundraising, but the greatest challenge for the system, I think, is this problem that we were talking about before of a fractured political conversation that all sort of moves the debate in one way, which was with loading more and more resources into things like prisons, and I think making promises that can't be kept and that shouldn't be kept. And I think that that political conversation is a real problem and has been a problem for most of my professional life. But we're now at a point where, this government, the first action it took on the first day that it was elected last year was releasing prisoners, because we literally are at a point where we're like, the courts cannot send not one more individual to courts because we don't have enough space. And so I think in a world in which people are talking tough but not recognizing the actual dynamics of the problem and what the realities of the system, I think that is a problem.
I think that leads me into this question. If you could change one thing in the UK system, what would you change? And if you've got a bunch, I can live with that too.
I mean, I think there are a few things I would change. I guess one of the things that I would like to see in this country, and again, it feels like a conversation that we can't have, is around things like how we police, legalize illegal drugs. I think when you look at the amount of time and energy that we spend on that in the criminal justice system and in the health system, I don't think any of the outcomes that we have the most drug deaths in, I think, Western Europe. Scotland certainly has more drug deaths than the rest of Western Europe. Something's not working about how we're dealing with the issue of illegal drugs. Now, I'm not at the moment saying we should legalize everything. I don't know what the answers are, but I want us to actually have a conversation about it. So that's one. I think the way that we recognize and deal with and have systems set up for issues like domestic abuse and sexual abuse, how our courts deal with those issues, the specialisms we need around it, the services we need around it to really tackle it, but also just how we as a society talk about gender relations, misogyny, etc. That's not a new problem. And in some ways, there's been a heap of progress as a society around that, but it is increasingly part of the criminal justice caseload. And I think we have systems that are set up to deal with acquisitive crimes, and actually we're dealing with much more complex, entrenched issues. So a range of those things. Maybe, it's time to call time on wigs and gowns in court.
Unfortunately, the United States started moving in the other direction about 50 years ago, where there were a number of states where judges didn't wear robes, and now almost none.
Right.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it, and I want to thank you for having been on Justice Speaks.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The Justice Speaks podcast is brought to you by the Justice Speakers Institute, LLC, the premier international speakers bureau on justice issues. This podcast is to give you the knowledge and be able to ask the questions on creating justice in your community.